Hi, everyone. Mike Malatesta here, and welcome back to the How Did Happen podcast. On this podcast, I dig in deep with every guest to explore the roots of their success, to discover not just how it happened, but why it matters. My mission is to find and share stories that inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you. On today's episode of the How Did Happen show, I'm having a conversation with Michael Ashley. We talk about storytelling, why pain and conflict are necessary and related components of a good story, how to write almost 50 books in less than 10 years, and why being grounded for a year turned his life around.
The biggest problem that I see is that we don't include enough conflict on the page. Conflict is everything. And the reason why is because conflict demonstrates character. But the way that you begin to connect with hearts and minds is that you tell a story using conflict to then get that exposition across.
I think you're going to love Michael's story and this conversation as much as I did. Please listen, watch, share, and most of all, enjoy. Hey, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. For those of you who've listened for a while, you know that I'm part of a group called Vistage. It's one of the groups that I'm a part of. And I was fortunate to run into Michael at our last Vistage meeting where he came to us as the expert on a lot of stuff that you're going to find out about as we go through the podcast. But I met him and I was like, yeah, I think his story is something that you'd want to hear and that I would want to explore. So he's here today and I'm so grateful. So let me tell you a little bit about Michael Ashley. Michael is a former Disney screenwriter and professional speaker. He's not a former professional speaker, though. You are still a professional speaker, correct?
That's
so
right.
I don't want to mislead you there. Michael Ashley is the author of over 25 books on numerous subjects, including 4 bestsellers. He serves as a columnist with Forbes, Entrepreneur, and Green Entrepreneur magazines. Prior to starting his own creative content agency, Michael began his career as a playwright and a newspaper reporter. A former screenwriting professor at Chapman University, he has been featured in KTLA. What is KTLA?
It's a TV news network.
Got it. Entertainment Weekly, the National Examiner, and the United Nations ITU News, the Orange County Business Journal, Fox Sports Radio, and the Orange County Register. He is a co-host of a podcast called Changing the Story and 2 podcasts, right, Michael? Changing the Story and United Nations Artistic Intelligence Series.
That's right.
And he serves as a story consultant for companies on how to best convey their messaging, which is what we did a lot of talking about when he was with our Vistage group. You can learn more about Michael at his website, which is Michael Ashley, ASHLEY publishing.com. So Michael, I start every podcast with the same simple question, and that is, how did it happen for you?
Absolutely. So I'd like to take you to the month of August in 2015. My son was born in March of 2015, and I had just finished writing my first novel for a client. It was actually 2 novels, and I was working as a magazine columnist at the time. Back then, we were living in Marin County, my wife and my young son, Teddy, and I was contemplating what next to do with my career when my wife said we should start our own company. That was in 2015. But to understand how that company got started, I want to go back in time. So we're going to go back in time to when I was 10 years old. And when I was 10 years old, my parents were separated and my mom was dating a guy, and he used to tell stories to my brother and me before we would go to bed at night. And these stories involved goblins and elves and dwarves, and I love these stories. And so one day, his name was Richard, and one day Richard said to me, these stories come from a book. They come from a book called The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And once he told me that, I went ahead and read the whole series in a month. In fact, I read the second book in one night. And when I was in 4th grade, my teacher gave us an assignment. It was the first assignment I ever had like this. She said that we could write a creative story about anything that we wanted to write about. And so I wrote a story and I turned it in. And then immediately my teacher called my mom, and she was very mad at my mom and very mad at me. And she asked my mom to come to school. And she said, "Your son just plagiarized Tolkien." And my mom said, "He didn't plagiarize Tolkien. He was inspired by Tolkien, but then he spent the whole weekend writing the story by himself." And Mrs. Jaworski was the name of my teacher. And she said to my mom, "Well, in that case, he's really good. And I want to support him and help him become a writer." And so that's how I got started on this writer's journey, how I became a storyteller. When I was in elementary school, I would write stories about my friends and me. And when I was in college, I became a newspaper reporter and a playwright. And then I went on to transfer to Chapman University, where I earned an MFA in screenwriting. And immediately from there, I began working in Hollywood. I worked under the head of the literary department at Creative Artists Agency. It was my job to read screenplays for different actors and directors and to give my feedback to the agents and even the president of CAA himself. And then, as you mentioned earlier, I created that movie for Disney. I wrote the treatment for Girl vs. Monster, which allowed me to quit my day job, allowed me to get an agent and to begin working in Hollywood on different projects before eventually getting into the publishing world, which is where the story comes full circle back to 2015 when we launched our company. So it's crazy to think about it now, but my wife, who did not know what the outcome would be, suggested that we go out on our own and create our own company. She's also a screenwriter who I met in film school. And since then, we launched our company, and I'm happy to tell you more about our company, but that's how it got started.
And what was it that she was seeing, Michael, that made her make that suggestion? And sounds like give you the confidence to start.
Well, what she was seeing back then was I had just come off of writing, it was actually 2 novels. I was working for a very wealthy client and kind of a patron of mine who really liked me and wanted to create a novel kind of similar to Harry Potter in length, of about 80,000 words, including his scientific concepts that were embedded in the story. And so back then I was working as a columnist for the energy sector, and I'd had a lot of successes with writing. And so she believed in my ability to turn this into a business. Back then, we had just come from living in Los Angeles and then briefly in Orange County. We both met at Chapman, which is in Orange County. So we had connections in the Bay, we had connections in LA, and we had connections in Orange County. And what she was thinking is she knew me very well, that I don't like working for other people. I don't like authority. I like to make my own way. And so I think she suspected that I would do best if I were to strike out on my own and create this thing on my own, which is exactly what happened.
And that authority thing, not liking authority, did that something that manifested as a kid, or is it something that you grew into because of working with someone where you were like, that's not right, sort of thing? Or how did it come to be?
No, it was probably one of the first things I remember as a kid. I was always the kid that was sent to the principal's office. I was the kid that didn't listen to his teachers, that was too busy goofing off and playing around.
Oh, really? I would not have pegged you for that.
Yeah. In fact, if you're interested, I'll give you a brief story about that.
Sure.
I was always in trouble in elementary school and junior high, and I was a very likable, popular kid. I was kind of like the class clown, but I didn't focus on school. And my parents would give me warnings and say, you have D's and F's, and you're not learning these things. But I didn't take it seriously. Long before I knew the word autodidact, I was that kind of person. I was just reading on my own. So I was very interested in ideas, and I was the kind of kid who would be in junior high, supposed to read the biology textbook. Instead, I was reading Catcher in the Rye. And so what happened was, condensing a lot of history, but I got into enough trouble that when I was 15 years old, I was grounded for about a year. And so I decided to go back and relearn everything that I was supposed to have learned up to freshman year of high school. And I did it in 1 year. And then I turned my life around, and I was picked as the number one all-around student when I was graduating, and I was accepted into several different prestigious awards and designations, like the Danforth Award, not for turning it all around, but because I did so well academically. So it took me a little while to get there because I wasn't listening to anyone else. But when I finally turned it around, it was because of me, because I was tired of being in trouble and not having the life I wanted.
I can't let that go by without asking, what do you have to do to get grounded for a year?
Good question. What had happened was my dad had gone out of town. He'd gone to Malaysia, actually. And so I was 15, and my friends and I decided to have a party. And as I mentioned, my parents were divorced. So my mom didn't really know what we were doing. And we took out my dad's car and we crashed it. And then I couldn't fix the car. So then we just decided to have a party for a few days. And when my dad returned, he had a meeting amongst all the families of the kids I was hanging out with. And in that meeting, we discussed all the things that happened for the last 3 or 4 years, all the times that we got in trouble. And it's hard to to talk your way out of it when you've been lying about all the other stuff. They tend to not believe you about that. So I just took responsibility for everything that we did because I didn't have a choice. And my parents were pretty upset about that. So I wasn't allowed to use the phone, see anybody, watch TV. I wasn't allowed to do anything for a very long time. It was actually close to 6 months to 9 months. But then I did something else that summer and I got in trouble one more time. So I kind of brought those together. So about a year between both incidents. I broke curfew because I went to see a girl. And the cops chased me, and I outran the cops. But then they went to my house because they caught my friend, and my dad made me go surrender myself at age 15. And my parents, who don't talk to each other very much, decided to get together and figure out what to do about their son. And at that point, it wasn't because of them. I just decided I was sick of being in trouble, and I wanted to have a different life.
So they collaborated. You were living with both of them at the time? Like, were you switching back and forth? Or
mostly my dad.
Living with your dad, okay.
Yeah.
So you kind of just did like a Holden Caulfield meets Ferris Bueller sort of thing there to get yourself.
Yeah, maybe with Zach Morris thrown in as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very nice. I did not see that coming. That's really. Before we get too far, well, the thing about Mrs. Jaworski cracked me up because it was almost like she, in the age of Chat GPT and all of that, she basically thought you had, plagiarized Lord of the Rings in order to write your paper or whatever. And it just made me think about how easy that might be now to actually pull that off.
Yeah.
But before we get too far, I do want to spend some time talking about, this publishing company that you and your wife have. As I recall from our meeting, I think I mentioned it in the bio, you've written 25 plus books, which is incredible. You've done that both on your own, like for yourself, and as a ghostwriter or a surrogate writer for other people. You've done a screenplay, you've got managed content strategy, you're a storyteller. You basically help people and companies design messaging. And I mean, it's like, I know I'm scratching the surface. I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork on what Michael Ashley Publishing is all about and why you do it.
Sure. Well, the number one thing that I do for my clients is I turn them into thought leaders through the power of storytelling, through words. And so that can take on different iterations. Mostly it's writing books for my clients. And so it's funny, I listened to that bio and it's actually a little bit slightly out of date. I'd actually say it's closer to 50 books at this point.
50 books? Oh my gosh. Okay.
And so they range. I've actually written 5 books on AI and big data. In fact, one of the new ones is coming out in July 25th. Through Fast Company Press. And so I've written about leadership, marketing. I've written about the space economy, telehealth, and I've also done very personal books, some about grief. I wrote a book about a Christian men's group. I've written life stories as well. Each time I begin that process with the question, how will this book help you in your life and or your career? And oftentimes they're one and the same. But those books are the big bucket of what I do. The second big bucket, I would say, is writing articles for my clients. So at any given point, we have about 10 different clients that we write for, different businesses, different individuals, and they're all different kinds of subjects. And I produce monthly articles for my clients, as well as I do web copy. I even create scripts. So we met because I was doing a presentation for Vistage. Well, I write people's presentations and their speeches for them, and then I help them with their messaging and their consulting on storytelling as well.
Okay. So I wrote a book, came out last year, or 2021, November of 2021. It took me about a year to write that and have it edited and ultimately published, just shy of a year. Mm-hmm. And you've written about 50 books and you are way younger than 50. So I'm wondering, and I think people that are listening to that are wondering, how does a person write 50 books in a very compressed period of time? So how's it work?
Well, I haven't slept in 7 years.
Oh, is that right? Okay. So now we have a whole another thing we can talk about is how to be what do they call that? People who can't sleep. It's called not insomniacs. There's an actual name for like the condition. Anyway, I'll think about that. But so yes, you have slept. So let's talk about the rest of it. Yes.
So I have a way to explain how to do this, but I have to back up and explain why I did it this way.
Okay.
So I went quickly through my bio, but back in the days in which I was working for CAA, I was an insurance broker, and I was screenwriting at night when I eventually got into the Disney program. Back then, I didn't get into everything that I was doing, but I was also producing a web series, and I had a girlfriend who's now my wife. and I had a social life. I didn't have kids though, so that's one thing that takes up a lot of time. But I had a lot going on in my life. And back then, what I would do is I had the insurance job. I was a broker in Los Angeles. So I'd write I worked from 8 to 5, and then I'd get home, and then I would write from 5:30 to 9, and I wrote on the weekends as well. I did this for about 5 years, and that gave me a lot of practice about project management and writing. And in between that, as I mentioned, I was reading scripts for CAA and doing coverage as well. And so I got to be very good at switching from project to project. And some people, I know that it's been said that if you multitask and you switch from one thing, it takes you a certain amount of minutes to get there. Yes. That may be true, but it's not really true for me. And so I'm able to jump from one thing into the next. And that's because of the practice that I had. And really, it had to do with economic conditions. In fact, my dad is a lawyer and told me not to be a writer. And that's a whole story if you ever want to hear it. But I basically was proving to the world that I can do this. My dad wanted me to take over his law firm, which my brother eventually ended up doing. And so I had a fire within me to demonstrate that I could be successful in this way. And so I would stop at nothing to maximize every minute of my day. And I think that's carried on until now. So you couple that kind of mentality and workflow system with what I'm going to explain next. So people wonder how I can write so many different books on so many different subjects. Well, I do it under a system. And so I begin every book with 6 questions. And the first question, as I mentioned earlier, is how will this book help you in your life or your career? And then I go to questions like, who is your audience? What is their problem? How do you offer to fix it? And then I go to, what is the thesis of your book? And then once we're clear on that, and it's typically 1 to 2 sentences, then we get to what the chapters would entail. And the way that I learned to write essays, a little bit after Mrs. Jaworski, it was through Mrs. Singer when I was in high school, was like this. You begin with a thesis statement, and then every paragraph backs up the thesis statement. And within every paragraph, you have sentences to back up the paragraph. Well, the same analogy is true when it comes to book writing. You have a thesis for your book, and every chapter backs up the thesis. And within every chapter, the sentences and the stories back up the chapter. So you have a comprehensive whole. Now, that just gives you the overall framework, and then I add my own creativity. I'll give you an example. I'm writing a book on the future of what we call the orbital age, the future of the private space economy. I'm writing this book with Tom Weiss, the CEO of Sierra Space. And so this has not come to fruition yet. I'm not writing about this in the past tense. It's future. This stuff is coming online as we speak. And so I wanted every chapter to be different. And so one chapter is called You Will Eat the Best Meal of Your Life in Space, and imagines a business luncheon, but in Orbital Reef, which is the world's first business park in space. And in order to do this, I had to bring on a very creative chef, and he was able to design a menu that you could prepare in microgravity and eat in microgravity. I'm mentioning this because every chapter is different like this. We have another chapter where I created a comic book last year with an artist from Marvel. So I wanted to show, not tell, what Orbital Reef will look like, and that's the private space station. So he imagined the whole chapter as a comic book. One chapter of this whole book is a comic book. So if you take that basis, those 6 questions, and then infuse it with creativity, you're able to come up with a different product and something that's unique. And then in addition to that, I have a team that are researching behind me. So in addition to me meeting with the clients, they're backing me up, getting me third-party scholarship, getting me the references I need so that I can move quickly. So between all those 3 things and some helpful time management is how I'm able to do it.
So thank you for sharing that. This, as you were talking through it, I was thinking, okay, so you're writing a book with a co-author, let's say. Mm-hmm. How do you co-authors choose to work with you or you with them? And then how's the work on something like that typically distributed?
Sure. Well, even though I often call it ghostwriting, it's a misnomer. It's actually co-writing. So all the books that I write, it's my client's name first and my name second. And so it's a really... So
you're always credited as the author, in other words?
Yes, I am. Right.
Okay.
And so it's really a meeting of the minds. And what I like to say to people is that that's really how it works in the publishing world. It's just that people don't know it. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people think that Harper Lee didn't really write To Kill a Mockingbird by herself. Truman Capote helped her out very much. And that's the case with a lot of editors. So one of my favorite books is On the Road. Well, Jack Kerouac, the version that he turned in, which was created with a lot of speed, a lot of coffee, maybe some cocaine, I don't know. The version he turned to his editor is not the version that I know and love. They've since published it. And in fact, I haven't read that new version, but the editor really is responsible for creating the version that we know and we love. In a similar fashion, Dee Allen is a very famous editor, and I believe she did the editing for The Godfather, but she definitely did it for a lot of movies. If you think about it, I read a book once when I went to film school. You take a movie like Star Wars, if you were to take the raw footage of Star Wars and put a different editor on there, you could have a very different movie. And so you can think about me as kind of like an editor in some ways. I'm also doing the majority of the writing, if not all of it. But I am translating my client's vision and bringing it to life just like an editor would. But I'm also writing it too. So we are really meeting together and we're building something together. That's the first part. And then the second thing that I would say is that as this company has been around year after year, I tend to get a lot of referrals. That's how I built my business. In the beginning, it was some days I met 8 different people in one day when I was building my business. I was doing a lot of networking in Orange County where we started it. Mm-hmm. And since then, it's got its own momentum, right? So I do a lot of speaking, which is how I met you. And I meet people. And so that's a big conduit for more clients. But often it's referrals, people that have worked with me in the past or people that have heard good things about me from the people that they know. That's typically how it comes to fruition. And then I decide if it's the right project for both of us, or they do too. But when they bring it to me.
And with the clients you work with, is a book often the starting, the place where you start a relationship with a client, or can people jump on, with you on different types of things, like some of the things I mentioned? Sure.
It happens in many different ways. It has begun before where I was producing articles for a client, or I came in and wrote their speech and they said, you know what, this should be a book. In fact, that just happened with a new client. Other times we will write a book together and then I'll end up doing articles. And I'll give you an example. So that book I mentioned, it's actually called Neuromind. It's about AI and big data. It's about the dangers that we face under technocracy. And Fast Company is publishing it. In order to get the word out, because it's not coming out for a few more months, we created a Substack to help build the awareness for the book. And so I am doing articles related to the book after we write it. And so they can kind of take on different facets in terms of which one begat the other.
Okay. And those Substack articles, are you taking like snippets out of the book and then just sort of building an article around it, or a lesson from the book, or what is it just driving?
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell me what it is.
Okay. So with this book it's speaking about unique ways to write a book. So let's back up and explain the problem, and then they'll inform why we wrote it this way. So people are not aware of the problems that we face under technocracy. In fact, most people, I would imagine, don't know what technocracy even is. And so for those that don't, I want to explain it. There are different definitions, but my definition would be that right now that we have centralized control through a handful of monopolies. In fact, the book proposal that I used to take this to the publisher used the analogy from the game Monopoly. And so what I was talking about was, you think about, the 1950s and 1960s. Main Street America enjoyed a lot of foot traffic. People would be walking by, you walk into the store, you have a good experience, you buy something. Well, along came Amazon, and these days many businesses have gone online. They use the Amazon store, and we saw this ratchet up even more under COVID when so many businesses had to close their doors. Well, okay, great. Amazon's helping you sell things, but what if Amazon decides to delist you one day? What if it decides that it will become your competitor? What are you going to do then? This is the danger of technocracy, but it manifests in other forms. So right now we're seeing things like deplatforming, debanking. A good example is what happened in Canada with the Freedom Convoy, which I wrote about for that book as well as for Forbes. Say what you will about what happened during the pandemic, but those people were fighting for our liberty, and the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau issued an emergency order that took the money from the protesters' banks and just took it from their accounts. Anyone that was even giving $15 to help them, an example of a grandma giving somebody $15, they took the money from her account and then they froze her credit card. And so the example that I give, and Robert give, that's my client in the book, Neuromind, is this. I wanted people to understand what a threat this is. And so not every chapter is like this. In fact, it's the only chapter this way, but I wrote it in a show and tell format. The show is an emotionally a visceral story, something you might read in a novel. And the tell is the context. And in the show, what I did was I wanted people to imagine it with the Rosa Parks story. So I told it's based on true events, but as we all know, Rosa Parks declined to give up her seat because, back in those days, Black people had to give up their seats to white people. And then the other part of the story is Martin Luther King Jr. worked with Rosa Parks and other people to boycott all of the white establishments that were treating them as subhumans. And because of their economic power, they were able to achieve the civil rights that they enjoy and many other people enjoy today. And what I wanted people to understand is, what if back then, when the Black people that weren't giving their money to the white establishments, what if their money disappeared? What if they couldn't spend any money? That's what's going on right now. So we don't have the power under big tech anymore, or at least it's being squeezed, where they can shut your bank account down. They can debank you. You no longer have a bank account. You are, in effect, shut out of society. And in the story, the sci-fi story that we use with Rosa Parks, that's exactly what happens. It's like magic realism. They go to give people money and their cash disappears in their hands. And I did this on purpose so that we could understand that the liberty and the freedoms that we enjoy today were built upon people that were fighting for them. And if you take away our ability to exchange goods and services in this economy, well, then you're disenfranchising people. And that's what the book is about. And so we found different creative ways to write every chapter in this fashion.
That is awesome. Technocracy. I don't think I was acquainted with that term. So I appreciate you saying it and explaining it. The example you were using there, I believe, was the truckers were protesting the requirement that they be vaccinated. I believe that's what, and they weren't leaving. And so that was sort of Trudeau's way of, I guess, upping the ante, but it sort of went right to, like, I want to say nuclear. It went right to like a nuclear reaction to something that was just a civil, and I think respectful protest on something they believed in. And especially at a time when truckers were the only way that stuff was moving, anywhere during, how we were getting stuff.
Right. Well, this isn't, by the way, this isn't a new thing. It's just one of the most glaring examples. But the United States government did this to Julian Assange back in 2011 after WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks,
what we were doing in this war, and the ways that the American government was misleading the people. And so you saw this example. They're doing it to Kanye West right now. Obviously they did it to Alex Jones. They're doing it to journalists right now who are protesting the Ukraine war. And it doesn't matter to me what side people view these problems, even though it's been presented in left and right terms. I don't agree with that. In fact, the first Substack that I wrote with Robert about this says this is not a left or right issue. It's a freedom issue. Today it'll be the people on the right. Tomorrow will be the people on the left. I don't care what side you are on. Everyone should care about this. And this is the thrust of the book, is that we've got to realize that we have more in common than we have apart.
So true. The differences that we have it's sort of like genetics. We're 99.999 the same genetically, and we're just like that little bit different. But if you focus on that little bit of difference, it's an easy way to just forget about how alike we all are. So I got to ask, with the book writing, you're writing a lot of books about AI, big data. I mentioned ChatGPT. There's a lot of technologies that are developing that have the possibility to replace or mimic what humans have traditionally done with writing books, writing articles, writing white papers, writing all of these things. How do you see this developing? And do you see it as good? Do you see it as bad? Do you see it as indifferent? Do you see it as a tool that's just like any computer tool? It could do more benefit than it does harm. Where do you see it?
Well, I'm probably going to get out of the writing business in the next few months. I'm just kidding.
You'll start sleeping all day. Yeah.
No, I have thought about it deeply, and I've used I've used ChatGPT. I've tested it out before. I wrote about it for that Substack recently, and so I've looked at it before. I think there is a danger, but it might not be what people think the danger is. So I'm going to go to the danger in a minute. There are many more dangers, but the one I want to talk about. From my experience using it so far, we have to remember that it's a chatbot. It's not as if it's a individual with agency. And I would even say it's not exactly AI. In some sense, it's using its training to produce something. It's not doing it in the moment. But let's not dwell on that for the moment. Let's talk about what it produces. I think on a superficial level, it is a problem, going back to Mrs. Jaworski, where high school students, college students, heck, I mean, even people that want to be authors can use this tool to produce the writing that they want. But it doesn't produce what I would say nuanced or complex or creative writing. It's very bare bones kind of stuff that you would get if you were a qualified 8th grader to write something. Now, that's not to say that it won't get there. I just don't believe it will. I think that there's
you don't believe it ever will.
I don't believe it ever will.
Okay, interesting. So, sorry to cut you up, but you'll get there. I'm sure.
Let's back up and for people that don't know the different parts of AI, there are 3 different parts of it. We have artificial narrow, which is our phones, right? And so they just do one thing for us. Okay, so it might take you from here to there, give you directions. Artificial general intelligence would be like you and me. And artificial intelligence is capable of doing the stuff that we take for granted. And then there's artificial superintelligence, which is basically, we're talking about an IQ that's in the like 1,000 or more, right? Something that you and I can't even imagine. For the longest time, most people have suggested we'll never get to AGI. That is a fully sentient beings, artificial intelligence, kind of like the Terminator, if you will, in those movies, or the Matrix. I don't think we're ever going to get there. Some people suggest we will. We'll see. This is still artificial narrow intelligence. We do not have a conscious agent that is creating something at this time. And so I don't think that, what I think it does well is it replicates. It creates something that already exists, takes it and marries it with something else. Now, it's based on the ground rules. Someone programmed it. It was Microsoft, and it was led by more than $1 billion cash infusion to create this. It's, I believe, another iteration of its version of Tay that was very unsuccessful several years ago, which is a funny story. Not funny, but it's a crazy story that's in the book, The Own the AI Revolution. Anyway, for those reasons, I'm not concerned about it. I think what it's actually going to do, and I wrote about this for my client recently, is that I think it's going to really delineate between who's a good writer and who's an average or mediocre writer. If you want to use this, it will produce okay articles or whatever it is that you're trying to create. But if you want something, like I mentioned earlier, if you want a book that is really creative, like I mentioned before with that kind of space book, if you want something that's going to emotionally grab people and compel them, something that is great literature or something that really makes you think, there's no way that ChatGPT is going to do that for us, at least not in the current iteration. I could be wrong. There could be something down the road that is different, but from my vantage point right now, I'm not seeing it. I'll pause there before I'll give you the danger, but
I think that's fair. So I've used it to create like blog, white paper-ish type content for a website so that you're at least getting some, search engine optimization articles out there. And I feel like it does a pretty good job of doing that because it's like technical writing, sort of. You give it a technical-ish question and it gives you a pretty decent technical answer, and then you just add in your stuff. So I see it as a tool to help with productivity, like to help a real writer with productivity, because like you said, you have a research team, well, it can do research. It can pull stuff for you, and then you can actually dress it up and add the creativity that it doesn't have. Right. So that's been my experience with it so far. So the dangers.
So to understand the danger, I want to go back a few years. When I first started my company, we weren't doing everything that we're doing now. At the beginning of my company, a big part of what I did was college essay coaching. So for about 2 years, I worked with about 50 to 100 different high school students and their families to create their essays to get to a good college. And unfortunately, even though I worked with students in very good schools, typically private schools in California, most of them, if not all of them, could not write an essay. They just couldn't. They were very bad essays. And what was even more alarming was they couldn't even think about what to write about. And I put the blame on 2 things. One, our terrible education system, and 2, parents that aren't emphasizing reading and writing. There is a very good book that came out just recently that talks about this. It's called The Dumbest Generation Grows Up. And I'm not trying to impugn an entire generation. That's just the name of the book. But his point is right. And that is this. The educators and the people that should have known better, who allowed young people to just do everything on their phones and throw away the Western canon of thought that had sustained Western civilization for the millennia, made a big mistake. The idea that this phone here will replace all of the knowledge, all of the important reading and writing that we need to do to develop a capable human being, a self-actualized human being, is just wrong. And so when I came around to work with those high school students that were the product of this kind of mentality, they were not externalizing their thoughts through writing. They weren't thinking deeply about things. They weren't writing and reading. More importantly, they weren't developing the kind of empathy that occurs when you read really good novels. So flash forward to today, right? This is only going to be worse. How many people do you know that can no longer do division or multiplication in their heads because a calculator does it, right? Now we're doing the same thing for writing and reading. What kind of students are we going to produce? What kind of adults are we going to produce? I mean, if you take ChatGPT to its logical conclusion, as I said earlier, I turn people into thought leaders through the power of their words. If you are being a fake, a phony, and having a ChatGPT book out of nothing because you can make up information and you seem to be an expert in the eyes of the public, well, you're a fraud. But what is that doing to our culture? Right now, we have a culture, or what we will have is a culture where people are fakes. I mean, we can talk about deep fakes if you want, because that's related to this problem. But I would say that the deep fake problem will manifest in a different way. We become deep fakes. We don't have knowledge. We don't have information. And I think the greater problem arises if and when our society begins to collapse. So right now, there are people that are saying that we don't have enough population to sustain our country. They're worried, and countries around the world, they're worried about supply chain issues. Okay, well, we've lived through the last 70 years of wonderful abundance where people didn't have to know things, that they could rely on their phone to get them where they need to go. They didn't have to use a Thomas guide. They didn't have to know how to do addition or division or multiplication. They didn't have to know great books or what it means to be learned or to have virtues, right? But those things are really, really important. And the more that we outsource them to computers, we are setting ourselves up for great risks to our society. And more importantly, we're losing so much value as a civilization.
You know, as you were talking there, I was thinking to myself that there's a big difference between being able to access information and actually knowing something. Yeah. There's a big difference between being able to access information and being able to learn. Mm-hmm. And I'm all for being able to access something that I need to know right away and I don't have time to learn.
Of course.
But I see your point. It's sort of like, I mean, tell me if this analogy works for you. Like if you were always treated like a baby all the time, whenever you needed something, it was given to you. It was right at your fingertips anytime. Would you ever learn to be an adult?
Exactly.
Probably not. Or a human who could survive for 10 seconds without, that thing or that resource right beside you.
Right. I'm sorry, I cut you off. But I was saying, I wrote a book called The Art of Routine. And in the last chapter, this was before ChatGPT, but in the last chapter, we were talking with an expert on AI. And we were asking this expert, does it make sense or would it be good if human beings had an AI that they could turn to that was always right, that never got anything wrong? And would this be a good thing? And it's a really good thought exercise. My answer to this is no. It goes back to what you said about being a baby. Actually, it goes back to how I met you. If you remember, one of the first things I said to your Vistage group is how important pain is, how important pain is to our story. You don't create a dynamic character in a story. You don't have Ebenezer Scrooge deciding to be a good person at the end of Charles Dickens' story unless he goes through pain. You don't have a Luke Skywalker who rises to the occasion and defeats the evil Darth Vader unless he experiences pain. In a similar fashion, a baby is not the same as an adult. A baby hasn't made mistakes. It hasn't experienced pain. And when we take all these things away, when we outsource them to an AI thinking that this is some other heuristic that's going to make life better and simpler and more convenient, there is some utility in that. I'm not discounting that. But what are we doing big picture wise? What kind of people are we producing? What kind of civilization are we producing when we take this aspect of ourselves away?
So let me follow up on that. Elon Musk has a neural net company, right? And they basically want to put a computer interface into your skull, right? Into your brain. Since you seem to have pretty strong opinions about this kind of thing, so I've heard people say, well, the neural net's going to be great because it's basically be like your full-time concierge, kind of like what you were just saying, someone who always has the answer whenever you want it. And then other people are like, ew, I don't think I would ever want someone interfacing with my brain in that way. And it is sort of the convergence of, AI, big data, big technocrats, all that stuff, right? So how do you feel about that?
Well, I got my I was going to make a joke about getting Neuralink, but I'll decide not to do that. Let's back up and say why. Well, let's talk about the public reason that Elon Musk says why we need Neuralink. So he has publicly said that he thinks that AI is the devil or the demon, and it's an evil that we cannot imagine. And so his rationale for Neuralink, at least his public rationale, is that if you can't beat them, you got to join them. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. He is suggesting that our problem will soon be AGI or ASI, more importantly, ASI, artificial superintelligence.
Superintelligence, yeah.
If we create the machines, they will somehow take our place and we'll never be able to even understand how they work and what they're suggesting. So we must merge with the machines. It seems like a good argument on its face. And maybe it is, but I don't like this idea, and I'm concerned about what Neuralink could do. If you think about the central problem that I'm trying to raise with that book, Neuralink, it's centralization. We're giving very, very powerful companies, more powerful than most nations on the earth, incredible power. You look at something like Alphabet or Meta, in which billions of people use them every day. Well, we're talking about monopolies on the scales that dwarf anything that was going on during the Gilded Age. And so now you give them these godlike powers, in a sense. What you're doing is you're allowing them to, if not control, then influence people's brains. Well, then what you should also understand, this comes from insiders like Yuval Harari, that he's very much mentioned in our book here, is that the new surveillance isn't what you do on the surface, it's under the skin. They can begin to detect different things based on your biometric readings. They can essentially begin to read your mind. And so if you go back to ChatGPT, a lot of the concerns that are raised about this is that it is not an objective AI. Just like human beings, because it was trained by human beings, it is subjective. And I don't care what people's political leanings are, but if you go into ChatGPT today, you can try it out for yourself. Ask it to write you a paper about how good President Donald Trump was, and then ask it to do the same thing for Joseph Biden, and you can see what the results are yourself. It is slanted. Now, that's fine if for whatever political party is in power, but let us remember that that same tool can be turned on you just as easily as it's now turned on the person that is in power. And so what I would suggest is when we begin, once again, to outsource more of our thinking to machines or whoever has the most control of those machines, then we are setting ourselves at a big disadvantage. I would suggest if you take this to its logical conclusion, we would create a world not too long from now where people can no longer resist the things that they don't like anymore. The government tells you to do something through these powerful corporations, and you physically cannot change. You can't do anything about it. And so I would encourage people to read up about Neuralink, learn about these things, learn about how all of the monkeys that participated in the experiment died in quite horribly, and just try to imagine how frustrating it is when your computer or your phone needs an update, a software update. Now imagine it's your brain.
Right.
There's many more things I could bring up, but those are just a few.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you spending some time on that with me, because that's, all of these things. I love hearing both, people who have a perspective on both sides of it. Most people don't have a perspective on any side of it yet because they just sort of avoid it, just kind of like, meh. Yeah, thank you for that. Let's get back to the uniqueness of humans when it comes to storytelling. One of the things that, we spent a lot of time when we were together creating stories for our business. And you started, just the way you answered the how did it happen question, you laid down a lot of storytelling breadcrumbs there. So you used names, you used dates, you put people in, you put us in a particular spot. You did all of these sort of things to, you could have told the same story, say, and not used any names, not used any places, and the story would have been the same, except the personal part of it, which is what I think most of us respond to the best, would have been stripped out. So you talked about thesis when you write a book, thesis, chapter, sentence. But what about the arc of story, Michael? What is it like if people are listening to this and they're thinking, how do I tell the best story about myself or about my business or about my passion or whatever? How do they go about that? What is the arc?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing you want to think about is pain or conflict. And they're synonymous in this situation, but they're not exactly the same thing. So let's talk about conflict for just a moment. If you think back to why we are drawn to TV shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, if you've ever thought about why people watch it so much, well, the people that create those shows are not stupid. We may think that the content is stupid or beneath us to watch it, but the people that are creating it are very, very intelligent. And what they're doing is they're using our natural curiosity about conflict. I coach people on their writing too, so that's another thing I didn't really mention, but I coach people how to write their books and different kinds of things. And the biggest problem that I see is that we don't include enough conflict on the page. Conflict is everything. And the reason why is because conflict demonstrates character. And we'll go back to Luke Skywalker for just a moment. And so the reason why I use this story is because it's pretty universally known. And the other reason is because George Lucas was actually friends with Joseph Campbell, who came up with the hero's journey. And so it follows the 12 stages of the hero's journey. And if we think about Luke for a moment, another problem that people have is they use the information dump in their stories. They just give you a whole bunch of content, but you have no emotional response to it, right? But the way that you begin to connect with hearts and minds is that you tell a story using conflict to then get that exposition across. So we think about the way that Luke is introduced in the movie Star Wars. We see his life in Tatooine, and for all intents and purposes, for someone who saw that in 1977, it didn't look so bad. But what is Luke's conflict in those stories? He does not like the drudgery of being a farmer on this barren planet. And so the first time we meet him, or the second time, he's arguing with his uncle and his aunt about having the life that he wants to create for himself. And so the writer could simply have said, Luke doesn't like this. He doesn't want to be a farmer. But that wouldn't have connected with us on an emotional basis. Instead, we viscerally experienced it with Luke. We experienced the drudgery that he is experiencing. That's a simple example, but a more interesting one would probably be the fear component, right? So when he's going up against Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back, and we just saw what Darth Vader is capable of doing, how he was able to put Han Solo into carbonite, how he was able to control Lando and really all the residents of Cloud City. He was able to exert so much power. And so Luke, who is one guy going up against the Empire, he's an underdog, and we see the conflict that he is going up against, and we empathize with him. We want to see justice prevail. We want to see the good guys beat the bad guys. And so the biggest suggestion that I would make when it comes to storytelling is think about the conflict in your story, because conflict will not only get people's attention, but it will help indicate people's character. It's how we respond in times of stress and disharmony that demonstrate who we really are. You and I could profess to be the nicest people on earth, but when something really tragic or scary occurs, it's how we respond in that moment that demonstrates who we are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and conflict can be anything really, right? Conflict can be a relationship. Conflict can be an illness or an injury. Conflict can be an inadequacy of some kind. I mean, right. So when you say conflict, am I right on that? Where there's not one type of conflict. There's all kinds of conflict.
There's different kinds. I mean, there's four kinds: humans versus nature, humans versus humans, and so on. There's different kinds. But what I would like to say is, very simplistically, when it comes to especially business storytelling, conflict can boil down to one thing: someone wants something and they can't get it. That's all it is. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be you fighting with lightsabers. It could be you want to get your mortgage loan approved and the bank won't let you. That's conflict. Now, on the other side is pain. And that's how you and I met. I was talking to your group about pain. And so pain to me is another very important part of it. They're related, almost like brothers or sisters. And the idea is this: if you think about why people change in stories, it's through pain. And so the example that I gave to your group comes from the treatment I sold to Disney. In the story that I wrote for Disney, Olivia Holt, who plays Skylar, begins as a stuck-up, selfish teenager who only thinks about herself. But when she introduces a bunch of scary monsters into her house at a slumber party, she has to rise to the occasion by becoming a strong leader who protects all the other kids. What made her change? It was pain. The pain of being killed by monsters was worse than facing her fears and becoming a hero. And what I say to people when it comes to business storytelling is, if it's only when your prospect is experiencing pain or is threatened with the prospect of pain that they're willing to make a change, that they're willing to consider working with you. So when we're thinking about the stories that we want to tell about our business, think about how to include as much conflict as possible to get people's attention, but how to include the pain there, because the pain is what really unites us. It's what really brings us into the story.
Got it. I was reading, I actually wrote this in the pages of notes that I took when you were talking to us. Like the day after, I think I was reading something from Stephen Pressfield. You're familiar with Stephen Pressfield, the author? Okay. Well, he wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, and he's written a number of books about the art of, his book is the war of art, not the art of war. He sort of did the Sun Tzu thing, and
right.
But one of the things that he wrote in this Wednesday email that he sends out was, the wilderness story is in all stories. Like the person is lost and then someone helps them become found, sort of thing. And I wanted to get your perspective on that, because it seems similar to like the hero's journey, like in the hero's journey, that they need a guide, right? Something happens and you need to step up, but you don't know how to, or you don't know what to do. And someone comes along, or you don't have the confidence or whatever. And someone comes along and as a guide, and they sort of convince you that you can do it or that you have to do it. Right. What about wilderness? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that it reminds me of enlightenment actually too. If you think about it like this, we were talking about babies earlier. I mean, if you think about, or maybe enlightenment could be substituted for self-actualization. We come into this world with really no knowledge, nothing. We are at the mercy of our culture, our parents, our society, our neighbors, our friends. And so it's up, and that's a wilderness. I mean, you basically have a gulf between the knowledge that you need and who you're going to become. That's right. The wilderness in my mind. And so over time, through pain, through conflict, through struggle, you attain more knowledge, and hopefully you attain more wisdom. And so that wilderness stops being a wilderness anymore, right? It becomes something more familiar, perhaps something that you love. And that turns you into the more actualized or enlightened person that you are. And so, if you return to the hero's journey, the last stage is return with the elixir. And so the idea is, after you defeat the enemy, you slay the dragon, it's not that you just, take a break there. You come back to the tribe or the community or the village, and you share that knowledge with other people. And to me, you're coming out of the wilderness and you're helping other people so that they're not so stuck in the wilderness themselves.
Right. Yeah. So you're basically paying it forward, sort of.
Yeah.
So with the couple minutes we have left, I'd like to learn a little bit about your podcast. So Changing the Story and United Nations Artistic Intelligence Series. I was intrigued by one of the titles to your Changing the Story podcast. It said something like, "Do you want to drive a garbage truck?" That intrigued me because I was driving a garbage truck when I was in college. That was actually the thing that happened in my life that created a career trajectory for me, which we don't need to get into now, but I just thought that was very interesting when I read that. So what's it about? What are you doing? What are you trying to accomplish with the podcast?
Sure. So I'll give you some background. I created the podcast with Neil Sahota. He was the gentleman that I wrote Own the AI Revolution with.
Oh, okay.
And Neil is a subject matter expert on artificial intelligence for the United Nations, which is actually where we launched that book together. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, if you remember that time, probably February or March of 2020, the amount of fear and just negativity that were going on in the world, I saw that around me, and I wanted to speaking of pain, I wanted to take all that pain and try to find something worthwhile, something valuable out of it. And so I wrote an article for Forbes. I had not written in this show and tell format before, but I did this a unique kind of way, an article I wrote for them, where I created a little kind of vignette, a story. And it took place many, many years after COVID. And it was about how we used all the bad stuff from COVID to create a better society. And one of the things I talked about was creating a more universal healthcare system in this country, so that people wouldn't needlessly die and get sick, or they wouldn't go bankrupt if they had some health emergency. So I took all the bad stuff that was going on and tried to use some sort of alchemical reaction and create positivity in the world. And so and it was it resonated with a lot of people on Forbes, especially so many people that were really sad and scared at that time. And so then I went to Neil right afterwards and I said, I don't know how long this lockdowns are going to go on. I don't know what the world's going to look like. Well, since we're at home on our computers, what if we just created a podcast? And we would interview all kinds of people, especially in tech, because we know a lot of people in tech, and ask them to come on and talk about the story that they wanted to change. Things that they saw that weren't going well, and how can we reimagine the story for good? So then we had about, 200 people on talking about various things from education to even civil rights, different ways that we can make the world a better place. And it was a lot of fun. And then in a related fashion, around that time, the UN, who were a big part of that book launch, and knew Neil, they wanted us to interview people, because what happened was the summit that was supposed to happen in person did not happen that year, obviously. And so they wondered if we could do something online. And so we could interview a lot of the people that were using AI for creative endeavors. And so we would have people on our show and talk about different uses of artificial intelligence to be more creative.
Got it. So you've done 200 episodes of Changing the Story. Is that what you said? 200 people?
I don't remember.
That's busy, man. You've been busy with that.
Yeah. It's on
starting
hold
when you start.
now, just because we're not doing it at the moment, but we did a lot of people.
Okay. Nice. Well, Michael, Ashley, I'm very, very grateful for having you on the show today. Before we leave, I just want to ask, is there anything that you want to share that I neglected to ask, or anything you want to ask me before we go, or just want to make sure I didn't miss anything you wanted to cover?
No, I might want to say one quick thing, and I think it's really important, and it kind of sums up my beliefs about this life, which is this. And I said something similar to your group, but I'll say it in a different way here. I think too often in this life, we feel disempowered, and we feel like what we do doesn't make a difference, and we just feel like cogs in the wheel. And we tend to use movies, especially TV, all these mediated forms of reality to kind of check out. And so we watch TikTok or YouTube or whatever, and we stop being drivers of our own lives. Instead, we watch other people's stories. And what I would encourage people to do is to recognize that you are living in a story. Yes, we get to watch stories and read about them, but you're living in a story too. And you can change it at any time. That's why I really wanted to use that title in the podcast, which is you can change the story of your life whenever you want. It just comes down to your agency and your willingness to accept what is being given to you, really to rise to the occasion, just like all those heroes we read about or we see on TV or in movies.
You can change the story of your life if you want to.
Yes.
That's awesome. Michael, thank you so much. It was really great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. And before you go, I just have 3 requests for you. 1, if you like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing or following the podcast on whatever podcast platform you prefer. If you're really into it, leave me a review, write something nice about me, give me 5 stars or whatever you feel is most appropriate. Number 2, I've got a book. It's called Ownershift: How Getting Selfish Got Me Unstuck. It's an Amazon bestseller. And I'd love for you to read it or listen to it on Audible or wherever else, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can get it everywhere. If you're looking for inspiration that will help you unlock your greatness and potential, order or download it today so that you can have your very own copy. And if you get it, please let me know what you think. Number 3, my newsletter. I do a newsletter every Thursday, and I talk about things that are interesting to me, or I give more information about the podcast and the podcast guests that I've had and the experiences that I've had with them. You can sign up for the podcast podcast today at my website, which is my name, MikeMalatesta.com. You do that right now, put in your email address, and you'll get the very next issue. The newsletter is short, thoughtful, and designed to inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you.